Disruptors, welcome back to the Disruption Podcast. Thanks for joining us again. Today is a really exciting conversation, so I'm glad you're here, and I know you'll be glad too. But before we jump in to the conversation today, I do want to mention to the podcast crew that we will have discussions today regarding domestic violence. If that topic is triggering to you, I do suggest you skip out on this episode. You can go back and listen to some of the episodes we've put out previously, or you can join us in the next couple weeks when we have a new episode out. Now, with that said, I do not want to spend any more time teasing up the conversation. Let's talk about who we've got joining us today. We have in this episode with Tracy and I, the Pamela Zaballa, who is the CEO of No More. If you don't know No More, it is a fascinating and really impactful global organization, an actual leading global nonprofit working to end domestic and sexual violence by increasing worldwide awareness. No More inspires action and fuels culture change. With more than 1,700 allied organizations worldwide, No More creates public awareness campaigns, educational resources, and community organizing tools that are available to everyone, all of you and your allies, free of charge. No More also advises leaders across the globe in all sectors on response and prevention regarding domestic violence. So as you can see, an incredibly important topic with an incredibly important leader. Hi, Pam.
Hi. Hi, Pam. This is Tracy. My pronouns are she, they, and I'm the host of the podcast along with Michelle. And great to have Pam here. I'm going to read Pam's bio because it's so long. She's been doing this work for like 20 years, Pam. That's like 2 decades. I just have to say, you're looking good after 2 decades.
Don't say that.
I've been doing this for 2 decades too. So you know, but I do think, I think what the work you've done has been powerful. It's been impactful. You're such a good human being. And so I do want to make sure that I cover off on your entire bio before we jump into this conversation. But, Pam, 2 decades, I said that again, worth of experience in this space has worked to support victims of violence by creating and setting up direct services as well as preventing abuse and assault from occurring in the first place. Pam started her work with UN in Honduras inside a women's prison, a post that inspired her to pursue a career supporting victims of gender-based violence. And along this path, she oversaw U.S. court programs with Safe Horizon and managed shelters for leading organizations in the UK and the U.S. Her role as a senior operational manager saw her portfolio of services, including 36 shelters, 8 advocacy programs, 12 children's services, and the creation of the first government-funded accommodation-based service in London for victims of human trafficking. In 2015, Pamela concentrated on policy, research, and communication projects, where she worked closely with governmental agencies, private sector companies, and the UK Parliament. During this time, she developed research and successful campaigns to support survivors of domestic and sexual violence and human trafficking. As Hestia's Prevention of Domestic Abuse Director, she created successful initiatives to utilize state-of-the-art technology to help victims and to engage corporations as partners in the effort to stop domestic and sexual violence with projects like Bright Sky app and Everyone's Business. She sits on several boards, advisory councils, and her expertise is highly sought after. And after previously consulting for No More, for the No More Foundation as their International Developmental Director, Pamela became the CEO of No More, and she's now been in that role for 4 years. And I think we were talking about that the other day. It seemed like it was yesterday that we just met. I can't believe it's been 4 years that you've been in that role.
No, me either. It feels like it was literally yesterday. It's crazy.
Yeah. And so, Pam and I know each other well. We met when I was at Uber as the head of women's safety. And of course, I have expertise in this space too, of domestic and sexual violence. So this is a topic that is really very important to me. But we connected and did great work, while I was at Uber. and no more became a partner of Uber. And Pam, I didn't drag her. I think she signed up for me to take her to several places across the globe along with me. And my team to meet different organizations in different regions to really help create global programs. And we'll talk a little bit more later about that global component of this epidemic. But it was such an honor to travel around with you, and it was also just a whole lot of fun. Like, I just adore you, and I think I think my favorite trip. You're gonna have to tell me before we kick this off. What was your favorite trip that we took together?
I think it's gonna have to be India.
Yeah.
I think it's gonna have to be, just because we were in the middle of a whole political crisis happening there at the moment. And it was just interesting. The whole experience was interesting. Also, their gender training was amazing. So yes, I'm going to say India. What do you think?
Yeah. I remember that train. Do you remember the driver training we did? And when the guy stood up and talked about how women, what they were wearing, like if they wouldn't wear these things, if they wouldn't do these things. And then this young man stood up who was also a driver and challenged him. And it was so great to see that it wasn't the instructor who was a woman in the organization, amazing organization, the Manas Foundation in India, who does great work. It wasn't them who intervened. You saw peers, and you saw this young man stand up and challenge those beliefs that are so untrue and so detrimental to women and what they face and others in this space. But I remember that. I remember sitting in there with you and others and watching that happen, and thought, this is like powerful to watch somebody do this, a young man do this. But I was go ahead.
No, I was going to say that when you saw that young man and others afterwards standing with him, those are the bits that give you faith, right? That, this is an issue that one day we'll find a solution, that it won't be as epidemic as it is right now, because you have young people standing up and challenging, others. And it was great to see that. It was a great moment.
That's so beautiful. I feel like we're seeing so much of just that hope and beauty, right? And up and coming generations and the youth. And I mean, I know that, for Tracy and I, this kind of conversation and a lot of what we'll talk about on this podcast is really, aimed at driving towards, emboldening and elevating those voices for change. So I love this story. It's really great.
Yeah. Yeah, because voices are so powerful, and we were, it's time for these Gen Zers and millennials to, do more of this for us, and we certainly want to help them, empower them in this space. I have to say, before we jump in, my favorite trip with you was going to Africa and going to Johannesburg and going to South Africa. That was one of my favorites, and I think, there's so many great memories. It's such a beautiful country, the people, the culture, like it's such a powerful experience also, just like India, to go there. And the memory that stands out for me is being in that room with those female Uber drivers and hearing their experience and how impactful that was to see what they faced, as women, not as drivers necessarily, but just as women in that, in where they work and their day to day and the violence that they face. At the time, they were talking about violence from the time that they were young women, and how they continue to just keep moving forward. And you heard these horrific stories and you thought, how can they even keep moving forward? How they can even keep doing the work that they do? But there's so much strength and there's so much power in their story. And it was so moved by those women in that community and what they were doing and the message they had for others who had experienced what they had experienced.
Absolutely pure resilience.
Yeah.
Looking at their way from a different angle, at what they had to do, again, from a different angle. I think it's interesting because, I'm sure we're going to come into this, but you learned there so many ways in which people coped, and actually programs were developed that, you would wish to see those in places like the US, like the UK, for example, or, we have more like a classical training regarding how we approach domestic violence victims, how we relate to them. But the fact that they've just come up with programs that suit their needs and operate the way that they work is, I think it was also eye-opening in South Africa for sure.
Yeah. Yeah, and it was, I think that whole experience was just such a wonderful experience while we were Uber, and the Uber giving us the opportunity to do what we did. And we stood up some amazing global programs and initiatives with teams across the globe. So, before I'll never forget those experiences that we have had. And before we move on, the only other thing I have to say is I think you still owe me a margarita. I think you still owe me a margarita, if I remember right.
No, I'm not sure about that. I think there's a bottle of tequila also that you owe me for lifting stuff, I believe. So I think we're going to tie in this one, but we should have a margarita, the three of us, as soon as we can possibly, for sure.
Well, I know, Pam, you're, joining us from the UK. So, as everybody says, right, it's 5:00 somewhere. Unfortunately, I think for Tracy and I, it's like a little early in the day. But I say we get that margarita together pretty soon, or else Tracy will never let you live it down.
I'm never going to let her live it down. In fact, this is not the first time I've reminded her. It might be every time I talk to her. All right. Well, Pam, so we're going to ask you every question we ask everyone who comes on the podcast. Tell us what disruption means to you.
For me, it means to try to change the status quo. So trying to just give a voice to things that are not right, and making that action of wanting to change that. If you take that action, it might be a small one, but you're disrupting in your own little way. I think that's important. So you don't have to necessarily work in a non-for-profit space or, be the new Greta. You can do your small thing, and that is disrupting enough.
Totally agree. Like, there's just so much power that we can do in our space where we're at, whether, no matter where we live, no matter where we work. And that collective action is so powerful and disrupting.
I often think about, to your point, Pam, giving a voice, right, to the issue. Like, I think so often, to Tracy's point, there's power in just the voice in and of itself. I mean, certainly we want to talk about actions, right? I mean, kind of what can we all do in support of the issues that we're passionate about, especially, the epidemic we're talking with you about today. But what I love our listeners to hear, which I think we kind of hit over and over again, is even just having the conversation, right? Let's talk about it. And in some ways, let's define or refine or even change that narrative so that the issue really hits home, right? And we can see where it is in our lives, and then, right, how we are driven to I think, impact the issue. So I think that's a beautiful description of disruption. I totally love it.
And then, the other question I want to ask, Pam, is, people, look at, women like us, like all of us, and in the positions that we're in. And it's really important for others who are like us to hear how we got to where we got to, and telling us, one or two things along our journey that helped get us where we are today. And as we look at your bio, over the last 20 years that you've been working in the space that you have, and you started working, in the UN in Honduras inside a women's prison, you talk about how that inspired you to pursue the career that you have in supporting victims of gender-based violence. So can you take us back to a time and tell us exactly, what it was about that work that inspired you to do what you do? And is there something along that journey that you can tell us about, or tell the audience, that helps them understand how you got to where you got to today, and in doing the powerful work that you do and being the person that you are?
Yes, absolutely. I think it's an interesting one because I studied international relations, and the kind of specialism was diplomatic service. So the Honduran government had made this commitment about having a professional diplomatic service. And I was one of the first kind of promotions that kind of came out of that. And so one of my first internships was with the UN. And I ended up in a women's prison working in a garden program they had. So, if you would have asked me at that point what my life was going to be, it was most likely an embassy in some city. But when I started kind of talking to the women in the prison, I started hearing their stories and why they were in prison. And at 20, I think I was, or 21, it always sounded to me that there was a perpetrator involved in the fact that they were there somehow. They had done something for a man. They had been really scared about that situation. They had actually grown up in violent households and then found violent partners. There was always an element of gender-based violence, and that really kind of came core to the fact that if that they wouldn't have gone through those experiences, maybe many of them wouldn't have been there. Not all of them, but some of them would definitely not be in that place. So it was very clear to me that it was an issue that needed to be dealt with. And as it goes, my next job was at Safe Horizon, working in Manhattan Family Court, which I call a university for anybody who wants to really talk about this subject. I mean, I saw every case, every situation, every combination of human coming together. Basically, all the myths around domestic violence were dispelled from me on that role. And yes, that took me on a journey into the UK. I did my studies here and finally really thought that there was something to be done at political level. So doing policy work became really important, and then comms and prevention, which is where we are now. But it's a whole journey. It's been 20 years within the same subject matter, but actually in different roles. And I think that has been really helpful for me, especially leading an organization, because I know what it feels to sit in almost every role. And that makes me, I think, a bit empathic to anybody that comes from the sector, with a problem or a story. So yes, that's been a little bit of my kind of personal journey, but very, very related to this issue always.
How do I think, I look at, I relate to hearing the stories, right? And coming from policing, I say that those stories, those people who sat in front of me talking about the most horrific things that they've experienced along their journey, have never left me, and they inspire me to do the work and have continued to do the work that I have done. Is that a similar feeling that you have in those stories? Like even 20 years ago, I'm sure you can remember some of the stories, some of the faces. How do those stories impact you today?
It's an interesting one because there's stories that stay with you. You don't know why, for one reason or another. And such was the case in the women's prison, but also in my shelter work here in the UK. Some of the stories that we were seeing or the situations that we faced, I remember having a perpetrator come with a bat to break every car outside the shelter. Situations like that you think, this woman are not only here because the relationship have failed or because they found, there was an abusive element to it. Their lives are at risk. Mm-hmm. You're literally protecting somebody's life. And I'm sure that's what you saw in policing, right? Mm-hmm. How many, here, I think in the UK, there was also a big number of police men, women last year that had been murdered on going into domestic violence situations, and I know that's the same case in the US. So it's interesting, but some stories always stay with you.
Mm-hmm. Well, maybe let's take a few minutes, Pam, and I do want to frame out the issue. So I know you and Tracy have had a ton of really, it sounds like, intense, dedicated and focused experience with regard to gender-based violence. You've both done incredible work in this space. And, and I think that for probably the majority of our fellow disruptors, we can all kind of conjure up in our minds what we think gender-based violence is, or kind of how we think domestic violence may look. But I'd like for you to help us again in this context, right, of giving this issue a voice, right, framing this narrative. I'd love for you to help us refine, I think, the definition of that issue as we have our conversation today. So, look, I pulled a couple stats off the No More website, right, and I think I've seen these stats pretty pervasively in this space. Maybe a percentage point change here or there potentially, but I think we're still seeing, right, 1 in 3 women and 1 in 6 men experience domestic and sexual violence at some point in their lives. We've also, I think our stats are that 1 in 5 women are actual survivors of rape. And even, as impactful, 1 in 4 women and 1 in 6 men have been sexually abused by the time they've turned 18. These are incredible numbers. And, in putting yourself in that space, right? Maybe seeing yourself in some of those statistics is a really difficult, I think, space to be in. So, I think what I'd love to hear from you, and maybe some of it is some of these myths that you say were dispelled, right, by some of your deep work in the space. Can you give us all context about the enormity and really the global pervasive impact of this issue, which I think is kind of one of those aspects of defining this narrative that's pretty near and dear to your heart?
Sure. I think that one of the things that always surprises me, Michelle, is the fact that the dynamics around gender-based violence or domestic violence precisely are so similar around the world that anywhere that you go, the stories are pretty similar. They might change context, culture, class, but the issue around having power and control from one person to another is the overriding theme. And however that might kind of look itself. And I think first during my work in court, and I think that was, a place, as I said, that I dispelled myths and why or wish, just who is affected by domestic violence? Well, I saw in Manhattan Family Court that everybody, rich people, poor people, every type of, race, class were coming there. And sometimes it was, 2 people from the same class, or sometimes it was, one class and, and another, or one race and another. And seeing all the intersectionalities, I think was what, really kind of left something for me in that experience. But then with some of the work that we do at No More, even the kind of the travels that we did with Tracy, talking about this in different parts of the world, was just hearing the same story. And, some of the services that we've had to set up here in London throughout my career were for other communities, Vietnamese, Polish, and it did not matter the background of some of these minority services, that the stories were the same. You could hear some small differences between maybe some specific issues like female genital mutilation happening, more in Africa, but still being seen a lot in the US and the UK through immigrant families, and why are those dynamics, played more in that region. But the issue itself, there's mainly an issue that happens to women, women taking kind of a back step here really was something that, we can just see everywhere. And I think when I talk to people, especially young people, I always say, look around. How many people do you know who actually have been affected by some of this? Mm-hmm. I've never come across somebody that said, no, I just don't know anybody, or it's never happened to me, or I've never heard a story like this. It is so common. We are almost blinded to it. It's almost like normal. But when you actually talk to survivors, these are life-changing experiences. This can damage somebody's lives and even their future generations' lives. So, a mother has been affected by rape, for example, will look at the way that she raises up her children in a different way. So, I mean, there is so much on it that it is important to understand how just pervasive it is.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm really intrigued by certainly everything you're saying, but the part of the comment you just made where you say it's so pervasive, right, that we're almost blinded to seeing, right, it happen either in our lives or in the lives of those that we love. Can you dig in a little bit more for us there? Do you think there's a reason? Is it, I don't know, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but why do you think it's almost an issue that we're blinded to?
I think because it was always very dealt and is still as a private issue. So it's very difficult for people to come and share their own stories about what has happened to them for many reasons, right? People judge, even families, are sometimes just not as supportive as they could be on some of these issues. So this privacy element has been really something that hasn't allowed people to kind of speak up. But in the last 10 years, we've seen a bit of a difference. The oncoming of social media, in terms of one of its benefits, has been to allow people to share their stories and how common this is. And by one people sharing their story, that might allow 3 others to say more. And so all of a sudden, we just not know by the stats, but you can go to Quora or Reddit or any forum and put the issue of domestic violence, and you get thousands of stories. So I think that is where some of the, again, hope in terms of where this will progress. But I think it's that secrecy element that has really has us where we are at the moment, for sure.
Yeah, that is so brave. It's certainly, something that I think we believe strongly in on the Disruption podcast, right, is, again, the value in that story. And, and it really makes me think back to your definition of disruption as well, right? That's just changing the status quo. It's changing the silencing of the issue and allowing people to speak and then seeing themselves, right, and the stories that they hear, so that, it kind of, I think, hopefully garners this like exponential outpouring of, a similar space where we can all, I guess, hold that space for each other. So I want, go ahead.
Go ahead. Before we jump to another question, I just want to add to that, that just really touches me, and just thinking about how systems across the board try to silence us. And, it's not just the issue of domestic and sexual violence, right? It's that privacy component, that part of, if we keep people silent, if they don't talk about this, people, one, they feel alone. They don't feel empowered. They don't feel like there's anyone out there that can truly relate to them. And so we see that beyond this issue. We see it in our community. I think about being a queer woman and how hard it is for people to come out and be public and talk about their stories because of, one, how people respond to it, but you're not always totally embraced by your story. And same thing, judgment comes, those type of things come. So it's very, it extends across. And I just think how powerful people's stories are for not just really disrupting and changing these systems that have oppressed us, but also just what it does for healing for that person, or the person who hears your story or a story that's similar to theirs in that moment, that it gives them that hope or that ability or that resource or that opportunity to elevate, to rise up from where they are, and also create just collective change across. So I just really wanted to talk a little bit about that. And also just you talk about, as we traveled the globe, how it's the similarities, right? And that was one of the things that in traveling to all 6 continents, which I had the opportunity to do, I had never seen this issue globally. I had only kind of understood that US centric view of it and experience of it. And as I traveled the globe, you found similar trends, you found the same story. And so it was not what I expected. And it was powerful to see that, but it also sent me the message, and I know it sends also you the message, Pam, and you can speak to this, is why it's so hard to understand why people don't see this as a global issue, and also how solutions can be developed because of those similar trends, because of those similarities. There's this kind of mentality out there that it's so different everywhere, that there are not common solutions that we can use to disrupt it. And that is probably as damaging a erroneous belief as some of the beliefs people have about, the experience of it, is also that erroneous belief around, it being, not a global issue. Or if they believe it's a global issue, there's not the investment to attack it and address it as a global issue. So, I know we're going to jump into that a little bit here in a bit, and we can either jump into it now, but that I think is just such an important topic for us to dive into.
I think, as you said it's a missed opportunity. It's how I define it in kind of disruption terms, a complete lack of vision on how to address this problem. I think it has a little bit of historical context. So if you think about it, the first shelters came out in the US and the UK around 1970. The first one in the UK, 1971. And so we really have around 50 years in which we've addressed this issue. And the first attempt was obviously to provide services, because if you hear the stories of the people in the first shelter here in the UK, which I had the pleasure to manage many, many years after, when it looked very different. For me, it looked like a 7-bedroom house. At some stage, it had 100 families in 1971, and the stories are harrowing, but it was the only place that women had to flee. So the sector develops on this intention of providing frontline services. And with that, afterwards, changes in the law came, and trying to enforce and just bring domestic violence a bit to the forefront. Prevention was left to the end. And it's still like a very poor sister in the whole effort to tackle gender-based violence in general. And the problem with that is that whilst we don't look at prevention very seriously, we're just going to be a revolving door of frontline services. People are going to come in and go through the law, well or poorly, because our conviction rates are so poor all over the place, that will never kind of put a stop, which is really like a generational thing that we want to do. And I think that's obviously one of the problems. And some people develop frontline services, they think local. They think my city, my town, the most my state. And if you put to that the fact that funding, which I think is the real culprit here, how funding has been distributed, it's for a city, it's by the state, it's for the state, for example, in the case of the US. And so there is almost like a sector that develops within, that state, and doesn't talk very well to other states to see how they're confronting, what they're doing, what innovations are they doing. So there's this lack kind of cross between organizations. Right? It's only at US level, but at country level, for countries, that's the dynamic just worsens, right? We started a project, which I'm going to talk afterwards, but we were emailing organizations around the world and working with them. And I think we received one from Tanzania saying, thank you, you're like the first organization that has ever reached out to us from outside. So that lack of collaboration, I call it lack of vision, because not only could there be more joint solutions, but there could also be more joint funding. So some of the solutions that people are putting in place are getting maybe new funding to look for a solution somewhere else, right? So we're just not exchanging knowledge in the way that we should. We are not sharing stories in the way that we should, and we're not creating a global movement in the way that we should around an issue that affects every country.
Well, do you want to dig in, Pam, a little bit more there with your ideas? Like, how do you think we move towards this global conversation, right? And potentially then global solutions?
I think one is, around what I was talking around funding, starting to look at, funding, trying to get funders to look at what they can actually achieve if they kind of work together. We're doing a bit of that with corporations who fund maybe many different charities throughout the world, but they kind of never work, within kind of the structure of getting them all together to maybe make a united push. So I think that's really important. Governments coming together with a more of a global vision of what domestic, violence or gender-based violence means for them. The U.S. government has just released a policy, for example, a global policy on it. So that's like really, really welcome. I think those are issues that would allow, for example, organizations to take a more global view. The issue that the reality and the fact that you don't have as many organizations as no more as you should is because the funding is national. Mainly, right? We are mainly funded by corporations. So we just take the message everywhere. So I think that is really important from that aspect in terms of looking for solutions in the future.
Yeah. And then how much of it, Pam, do you think it's the organizations themselves and what they can do? Because I found working, of course, in corporations and standing up these partnerships and standing up these programs that there's also just a lot within. And I saw this. There's just a lack of collaboration across these organizations themselves. What do you think prevents that from organizations working more openly and together? And I don't want to give the impression that they don't, but there was a lot of like competition, I would say, when I was, trying to do the work I was doing and bringing in these organizations.
I mean, certainly, more work can be done on bringing sectors together to work a little bit more on this. And this is where funding issues become a problem because people become competitors. I always tell everybody to think about a non-for-profits exactly as what it says, right? It's a business that, the money's reinvested on the business, but the dynamic of it is the same one as a business. And therefore you are going out, selling a product, competing with others. And so what tends to happen to leadership is that they come in and they get into this business game. And what I think they tend to forget is their mission statement. So we always have to come back to mission statements when we talk about non-for-profit. So for example, if I invest a lot of money in training in my staff, yes, they might leave me in 2 years. That is true. But they will go and gonna work either in another NGO who has the same mission, therefore my mission will be achieved, or they'll end up in a corporate where they'll be supporting a team who will be doing the same thing. So you have to stick to your mission values, and then you'll know that. I mean, gender-based violence is such a pervasive, big issue. There is not one organization that can deal with this. It's crazy thinking. So I think leadership, and we've had many discussions, especially with some of the US leaders currently, about how can we just show examples of partnerships that work? How can we as leaders become models for other organizations throughout the world that actually can show that we can actually work together, that we don't have to compete with the same? And I think some of the work that is being done, I think here in the UK, is about getting government involved on looking at how they fund, right? So to make sure that they don't stimulate competition at that level, right? So we're all working for the same thing. We're all doing the same thing. But ultimately, those leaders have the same pressures that a business have, right? We have staff, we have to pay them, etc. So it's trying to find a solution around that for sure.
Yeah.
That's a tough one in the leadership, I think, context for any, I would suggest what I'd call a scarcity model, right? Like this idea that there's just not enough, and that we can't partner together in kind of abundance, but instead, we're challenged to compete with each other. And I've heard other leaders in different spaces talk about, the value of coming together behind a mission, right? Instead of a capitalist, if you will, model. And I just applaud, that leadership approach from you, especially in this space. I also, sorry, go ahead, Pam.
No, I was just going to say that, I think no more Jane Randall, the founder, and her other kind of co-founder, Anne, they had that vision when they created No More, right? They wanted to bring the domestic and the sexual violence space together, because in the US they were kind of walking in two lines and it didn't really make sense under kind of the gender-based violence banner. But it was also about creating a logo and a campaign that was completely open source, that nobody owned, that everybody could do everything that they wanted with, because it also became an issue where marketing campaigns were becoming the bits that only the bigger and better funded organizations could do. It almost kind of gave you exclusivity and branding, and there was a lot of that. So I think they were great disruptors in seeing the model and thinking, how can we do something better?
Yeah, that's a nice call out for Jane, who I know personally as well as a disruptor. So I definitely agree with that. I wonder too, so as you were talking, Pam, about, the global epidemic nature of this issue and really hitting on, kind of the collaborative or lack of collaborative nature across the globe and a lot of the funding concerns, like something that, kind of struck me is the idea that, that maybe people are more apt or willing to put time, effort, resources behind an issue when they see themselves in that issue, right? Or more readily see somebody that they love or that they know. And so, the other thing I wanted to just to hit on with you in kind of, again, really framing the issue is, for a lot of our younger listeners, I think, there is potentially a tendency to view the issue of a domestic violence situation like, an older, maybe married, hetero couple with, a component of maybe physical impact or violence in the home, right? And I think I know enough to know that, that really the abuse impacts are much different these days. Now, that's not to say that, that physical violence component doesn't still exist, tragically. But I'm interested in this idea of tech abuse, right? And how these different platforms and these different manners of abuse are really used, given, how tech we all are, how connected we all are in these online spaces. Can you talk to our fellow disruptors a little bit about, what tech abuse means to you, how you define that? And again, how we can really start to, recraft the narrative of what domestic and sexual violence looks like.
I think you said it quite right. The idea that domestic violence is always physical sometimes alienates people and think, oh, that has not never happened to me. They can't even identify with the term. So there's been many countries that have made the shift to domestic abuse as a term, for example, just kind of put together the whole nature of the package. And tech abuse is really the same kind of abuse that is facilitated by technology, right? So we've moved in a completely different space where some of the abuse that we used to see, always, has actually now being made easier. For example, the case of stalking or cyber stalking, right? There are so many ways to track somebody. I mean, before somebody had literally to stand, outside your door and follow you around, or ask people to follow you or pay to follow you. Now from an air tag to a button in your mobile phone will track you. So I think, that is, again, same dynamic, but different method. And the fact that technology is now accessible, again, example, air tags, easy to get and easy to control. And also that it can be anonymous. You don't really need to know who's behind it, right? So I think that is another great example is cyber flashing, because before, in terms of flashing, you actually needed to have an individual who was kind of flashing around the streets, and people would kind of, call the police and get, all nervous about it. And now you get on your phone pictures of somebody who just wants to send you a naked picture. Same issue. But people are more dismissive about it, right? It's not the same reaction. I'm not going to go call the police, right? Like if I had a flasher in front of my house. And there could be, of course, the kind of physical threat of the nature of having a person, but it's just how permissive technology just seems to be about some of the same issues that we were seeing before. And I think that's where, when I talk to young people, I always tell them things, for example, like getting somebody to force you to send a picture, asking you, harassing you almost to send a picture of yourself that you don't want to do. If something doesn't feel right in your gut, it's probably wrong.
Don't do
That's
it.
right.
Don't do it, right?
That's my number one safety tip. Follow your intuition. Yeah.
Sure. It usually is the case because, then we have revenge porn or distribution of images from people, who have actually given their consent. So the lack of consent on the image is not an issue, but was never consented to distribute them in the way that they were afterwards. And with that comes extortion, other forms of tech abuse that I think our kind of younger kind of followers will be more familiar with. And they all come under the gender-based violence spectrum, right? They all come on this kind of need of power or control, or, I'm going to threaten you, or I can do whatever I want without consent. Yeah. Sending a picture out that you have not given permission to is an assault to you. So just making sure that people don't see, rape and physical assault as the only things in the spectrum. There are many, many behaviors that are completely inappropriate and abusive and a crime. Most importantly, they're a crime. And that's something that I also like to remind people constantly about, both.
Yeah. And two things I want to say to that too. The other, I think, really good safety tip is we see technology facilitated abuse and things happening online is to, is really to look at boundaries. Like, how does somebody respond when you say no to sending a picture? How do they respond to you? Do they accept that, or do they still try to get you to do what they want you to do? And I tell people that if somebody violates your boundaries in a small way, they will violate your boundaries in a big way. And that's something else I think is a flag to potential abuser or somebody who may harm you online. And that leads me into the next thing, Pam, is that we see this belief out there when we look at online safety, we look at online harm, that if it happens online, it's not as bad as it is in real life. And just really trying to speak to that myth, but can you speak to that as an expert of how harmful it is much online, psychological and emotional abuse, as it is happening in real life? Because, people are having a hard time accepting the fact that these things that are happening online are just as harmful as when they happen in real life.
I think we have two issues, which we'll love to challenge as the nature of the podcast. Is I think people from, I'm going to say my generation and above, are very, we're behind in really understanding the impact that tech abuse has. Maybe we don't kind of want to, maybe don't want to kind of really talk to our children in an open way about what the impact is. But we don't even sometimes know the tools. So it's becoming very difficult for parents to track the technology that, children are using where they're getting groomed or et cetera, right? Partially because technology is moving all the time. So it's difficult. But there is an added effort, I think, that especially, we need to make sure that our young people are safe. But the other item there that I think is quite important is just diminishing this behavior constantly is a problem, right? And the lack of enforcement that comes with it. So right now, you could report something like revenge porn. You go to a police station and, it's hard that people will take it seriously. And some people with revenge porn, their lives can be completely shattered just knowing that there is pictures of them having sex, naked or whatever out there. It can be completely consuming for somebody's mental health. And that is important for all of us to acknowledge in the same way that when somebody is physically sexually assaulted, it is life shattering for many victims that I've come across.
Yeah, I was going to say, Pam, you froze up there for a minute, so we might have to go back and just talk about, I would start from the space of when you were talking about revenge porn and how damaging it can be.
Well, I will start by saying that. No, revenge porn can be completely and utterly damaged. I've seen many young women who really find it difficult to cope after knowing that there are pictures out there. There might be girls in university with careers in front of them, and they are worried that this is going to surface. So we can't dismiss that or not compare it to, sexual assault of other type or, even rape. It can be destroying for mental health.
And I would say one more. Go ahead, Michelle.
Yeah, you go.
I was going to say one last thing before you jump into other questions is I think this is important. What you said is important to really amplify is that this is a problem across systems. We see that, government is not necessarily responding to this the right way. Corporations are not policing. Like there's so much that needs to be improved in this space and how we respond to online harm and what it looks like. And so I just, the problem is across all systems when it comes to this. It's not just, creating awareness and educating in the space of the user as well. But I would, and it also just shows the need for collaboration and the role that all of these systems play in preventing and disrupting this type of online harm. So I think it would be great to hear before we jump, Pam, just quickly, we talk about corporations and their role. How do you see corporations' role in this?
I think corporations have a big role to play. I sit in the board of an organization called the Employers Initiative Against Domestic Abuse, for which many corporates are members. And I think there are different things that they can do. One is definitely look at their product. That is important because they might have a lot of safety tools in their hands to support that. Look at their employees, make sure that they have policies that support their employees if they're victims. And I think that's important because that also installs a culture where domestic violence and sexual abuse can be spoken about. And that translates naturally into product development and thinking. And then one of the other most important things that they can do is definitely use their voice. Once they're looking at their products, they have a voice that is so big. It doesn't matter if all the NGOs, I say, hug together and put, one message. One corporation can beat that with their eyes closed. So I think it's very important for them to help in making sure that we're all kind of coming to this kind of global idea that, this topic is one that needs to be dealt with in many different ways.
Yep. Yeah, they absolutely have the technology and the power and the voice, the scale across the globe to really create impactful change.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think we all recognize that. I often will try and think the best. And so for organizations who want to do the right thing, for individuals, right, Pam, who also want to be part of the solution. Again, as we heard at the top of this podcast, No More is a global leading nonprofit organization that is really just doing so much in this space. Can you, tell us all about No More, certainly about, your work in that organization, and then maybe kind of tie it in too as to how No More is really leading disruption in this space and how you're partnering with, not only the corporations, but even where the individuals can come in and make an impact.
Yes, No More is an organization focused on prevention of domestic and sexual violence globally. And the way that we do that is, as I said, I think when, our founder had the idea was create resources that are free. That everybody can access, that they can put their logo. There is absolutely kind of no competition on that. Let's form communities, chapters. We have over 40 chapters around the world. And that was important, and a big allied network of organizations, around 1,800 currently. And I think that was also important to create a sense of community. So every day, more working on this concept of a No More community that is coming together to speak up around this issue. I think another big disruption moment that No More had was the launch of our global directory in 2020. 2021, actually, sorry. And that was important because it's incredible to believe that in that date, a global directory for resources for an issue like domestic and sexual violence did not exist. It's nothing more than a database, but right now is the main resource that exists out there for people to get help wherever they are. And that for me was always kind of, just mind-boggling, an issue that, affects so many people, so many women. Not having even a list of where to get help sounded crazy. And so I think that's, part of the work that many corporations supported us in doing, Uber and NSA being one of them. So I think it's, very, very important, and something that, we take a lot of pride on working, and it's now being used by so many corporates and international organizations too.
Yeah, it's definitely one thing that I always recommend that corporations use. I couldn't believe it and talking to Pam and No More when we were traveling the world and being able to be like, okay, where can we get these resources and where can we have this for people to go? Our users are around the world. It's like, it doesn't exist. And so for No More to step up and create something that, you would have thought existed. You would have thought it was out there, and it wasn't. And it is such a critical resource that I continue to send people to. I talk to a lot of solo women travelers and organizations, and they're like, how do we find help if we're traveling in this country or we're going to this region or this happens? And not all communities feel comfortable reporting to police. And so they want to know where is a group that's working on the front lines on this issue, can give me support, and who is also going to be accepting of who I am as well, and feel safe to go forward with getting support and help. And so it's such a critical resource. And I think, it's on your website. I think, Pam, if there's listeners, it's definitely a great resource to have. We've seen some corporations, build and provide that, like Uber. We definitely want to see other corporations embrace that and provide that. So I just think that's one of the most invaluable resources. I still send people to that today. It's such an amazing tool to have out there. So how can, Pam, our users access that and find it?
nomoredirectory.org, and you'll find, as I said, every country listed. At the moment, I think we are -2. North Korea is not listed, and Afghanistan, but especially for people hearing us in the US, you will find there the most important numbers, the hotline, sexual assault helpline, and you can also find domestic shelters website, which you can just put your postcode and find services very near you. So that's a great way. I always tell people, you might not be a victim, but be prepared for the day that somebody shares a story. Please listen to them and know where to go to try to get them the professional help that they need. So I think that's very, very important. And I think another bit that, No More does in terms of kind of disruption, just elevating people's voices, is what we're kind of celebrating now, which is No More Week. No More Week. It just brings voices from all over the world, from corporations to civil society. For example, we're having a webinar around art and survivors and how that helps them express themselves. So you'll see some familiar faces. They've always supported No More. We've been blessed with having celebrity activism, around us. So I think it's a very important week to learn about this issue, which is one of the things that we can do individually. Because if we're not informed, it's very hard to kind of, give judgment or help somebody in need. So that is very important. And there are many ways if you go to our website, nomore.org, where you can elevate your voice, grab your own placard, put your name, say something in social, right? This is an issue. The more people around us know that we do not agree with behaviors that are stereotypical, toxic masculinity, for example, then the more they know that they can't do that in private. So I think it's very important for us to put out there our points of view.
Yeah, so tell us more, Pam. No More Week sounds impactful. It also sounds exciting, and I think it's right around the corner. Can you give us like some dates, maybe a little bit of what we can expect during No More Week? With a teaser that I will be signing up for the 5K. I know that everyone's really excited to hear that, and I just wanted to put that out.
Let me say that I'm the only person that's not excited to hear that. I'll be doing the virtual 5K too, Pam, but I hate running. I absolutely despise running. And Michelle loves running.
I do. I love me a run.
Like, she loves running and listening to her podcast. Oh, she comes back from that run, and just the thought of a run just makes me, like I just get nauseous.
This is the one run that you will love to do.
I will.
It is going to feel good.
I will love it, but I need to convince Pam that we need to do virtual push-ups too. Like, we need to be more inclusive of the people who hate running. Come on now.
No, in this virtual race, you can walk, you can, just tiptoe if you want to. There's no need for that. But the most important thing is that you do it. So you can kind of, raise your voice and say that you're enjoying the week somehow. So that is one of the ways, certainly the weekend. We've had a lot of success. State Farm and the NFL sponsored the week, and a lot of people from in the case of State Farm, for example, get really involved, and that's really exciting to kind of have just that kind of activism. And the other side is there's as I said, a global webinar kind of series and knowledge-based learning action program, of which, of course, this podcast is part of. So we were very excited to have both of you in the week, and that's very important. And we're also launching a domestic violence app with and the leading organization is Women's Center in Pittsburgh Shelters, and they're doing an app called Bright Sky that is already in 14 markets across Europe and Africa. But it's a joint partnership between them, domestic shelters. No More is helping kind of push it and market it out, and Vodafone Americas. So another corporate coming in to provide a kind of all-inclusive domestic violence resource in the U.S. So we're very excited about that. And we've seen the results in all the other Vodafone markets that have it, and it's absolutely amazing. So in our conversation around corporations and what they can do, it's infinite. Really, it's that decision, right? Like, let's do something, let's speak up. And we've never, ever seen a campaign around this topic that has failed a corporate to actually, put their message out there.
Oh, that's a good point to highlight, is that, there is oftentimes hesitation around this topic from corporations to get involved. And, you're right. There has not been anything but positive come from the involvement in partnering on these important issues that affect our community and affect the consumers of these corporations.
Here in the UK chapter partnered with HSBC on financial abuse. Literally every train station, every bus stop had signs. I mean, it's just out of order, and people really engage in the financial abuse discussion. And if you go to any pharmacy too, the first thing that you'll see is a No More logo, which means that you can actually go to ask for a safe space or talk to somebody in the pharmacy about getting you support. So there is so much that can be done with, just small but significant. I think, in the case of, I can see from HSBC, for example, it's an excellent campaign, that put them in the center of the conversation too. So there is so much for talking about the topic for the moral reasons, but there's also a very clear business case why these topics should be addressed: climate issues, gender issues, for example. So, yes.
It's good for business. And I know we're, setting aside my teasing about the 5K, we truly are honored to be a part of No More Week and helping support the organization and the great work that you and the organization are doing.
Yeah.
So we're going to have to send you your T-shirts, and we're going to see a poster of both of you.
100%.
That's right.
Smiling.
Okay.
That's right.
Smiling.
So I'm definitely going to put all of this information in our show notes, right? So that, our fellow disruptors can find out how to get involved and, know where to go for a deeper, kind of set of information. But I believe No More Week kicks off March 5th, if I'm not mistaken. And so looking forward to just like a really instructive, impactful, and, and I think in a way, a really informative, right, time where we can all learn together, grow together, and figure out our unique ways to be part of that solution. I also would be remiss if I didn't just say, Pam, that like one of the most beautiful things, in what you've described throughout this entire conversation is, again, your core mission of community and creating that community. I mean, it's something that that Tracy and I believe in strongly. It's, a big reason why we like having these discussions in this podcast format with just visionary leaders like you. And all of the, the things that No More is doing, right? The global directory, No More Week even, is just such a beautiful example of you putting that community vision into leadership. And so not only do we need more of that with regard to this global epidemic issue, but we just need more leaders like you, out there in the space who are committed to vision and mission and really, putting their efforts towards seeing that come to light.
I think when you see some of the activations that happen during No More Week, many of which we don't expect, they just start kind of, coming through social media. You see the small groups in universities. We have a couple of frats, for example, that are going to do full-on campaigns this year. And just seeing young men really trying to get involved with their community in their university. It's such a way to show young people to serve too, right? By forming part of something like this. So we're always kind of surprised, but I think it's prevention has to be done at community level. But there has to be also kind of an overarching kind of voice that says we're all making this push to change.
Yeah. I love it. I think when you shine that light, right, that light comes flooding back on you. So that's beautiful.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I know some of our, this will be actually live and playing during No More Week. So I think also, Pam, if they're listening to it during No More Week, they can still get involved, right?
Definitely, in terms of the race, and until the 12th, there will be all of this activism happening around the race. But that's when also you'll see the schedule of events and activities. So please go to nomore.org and you'll be able to find all the information that you need.
Great.
Well, like I said, we will make sure that our listeners have access to all of that great information. And look, fellow disruptors, we're going to be back in 2 more weeks with another disruptive episode straight from us to you. I'll do a few of these little kind of, like housekeeping wrap up items where, our disruptors and anybody who you think would be interested in this disruption conversation can find us on really any platform where you hear your podcasts. That includes Apple, Google, Spotify. And of course, when you want to see the lovely Pam, and Tracy and I, you can go to our YouTube channel and follow us there too.
Yeah. You can see how good our hair looks. You can see how good our hair looks. All three of us looking good today.
Well, hair is very important to at least one of us, I know.
At least to one of us, for sure.
And assuming that you have enjoyed, certainly, some of our lighter banter, but really, taken heart in the deeper conversation we've had today, we'd love to hear your feedback on any of those platforms. If you can leave us a review, 5 stars is great, but however your heart is leading you is also great as well. We'd love to incorporate that feedback into what we offer to you next time. So let us know what you thought about this conversation. And certainly we hope to see everybody virtually, at least, if not in person, during No More Week.
Yeah. And I think our final goodbye will be our call to action. So before I hand it to Pam to give us our final call to action, I just want to say how much I adore you, Pam. Thank you for, always being, I mean, people need to hear you've been in the trenches with me at times, but you are always responsive. Anytime I've needed help, anytime I'm trying to find an organization around the world when others have not responded or, say, I have no idea, like, even if you have no idea, you help me find it. You always go above and beyond to help me help others. And you're just amazing. And I just am so grateful and thankful for you and who you are as a person. Yes, No More is a wonderful organization to work for. But you are just such a fantastic leader who genuinely puts people first and cares very deeply about people. So thank you for investing in me and helping me do the work that I do as well. I know how busy you are, and I appreciate the time that you give me.
And thank you so much. You've always, been very supportive with the team. We absolutely love you. Thank you so much. There's been great experiences that No More has had because of the work that we've done with you. So always really, really grateful. And I'm really looking forward to everything that is coming. And in terms of kind of a call to action is to everybody, the simplest thing, let's not dismiss the subject. It's happening to too many people around us. Let's learn. Let's make sure we're prepared to have a conversation around this. But most importantly, if anybody ever tells you that they are suffering from domestic abuse or sexual assault, let's make sure we listen to them, we believe them, and we get them the right resources. And if we're prepared to do that and get involved and speak up, we are doing definitely our part.
Absolutely. Well, with that, I would say, calling all of our champions and disruptors, let's assemble and get ready to disrupt.